Hey everyone, how are you? Dropping in for a small video on Christmas Eve, wishing all our uh, religious friends around the world an amazing holiday today. In general, we are in a time that's called like the seven sacred weeks. So, around the shortest day of the year, all religions around the world, all cultures always had a kind of a celebration dating back to the pagan times, to the beginning of humanity. We had Diwali in India a few weeks ago, then it went into Hanukkah, and now we have Christmas and then the New Year's. So these are special times for all of the people around the world. And I think it's beautiful to see how every culture, how every religion expresses itself a little bit differently, but there's also something there that connects everyone. So, what is this video gonna be about? Let's talk about knots. Okay, let's do a little bit of a game with knots and see how capoeira could be maybe a good tool for recognizing our knots and for untying our knots. So, interesting thing about a knot, when it starts out, right? It's not a problem. Yeah, if this is it, it's not really a problem. It only starts to become a problem if I pull on both sides and I tighten it, right? And even here, it's not such a big problem. Even just by releasing, it's already starting to untie. But if I keep pulling and keep pulling and keep pulling and keep pulling, this knot will get very tight to a point that it's harder and harder to untie it, right? Girls know this. That's why they comb their hair every day. We don't have this problem. But if you have long hair, you know that it's enough 1 or 2 days not to comb it and things start getting out of hand, right? Um, so as human beings, we tend to not comb certain aspects of ourselves, right? On a daily basis, we tend to let things a little bit slip away. It's part of, our existence. And sometimes we don't really comb our thoughts every day to see where the knots are, and we don't really comb our emotions every day to see where the knots are, and we don't really comb our bodies every day, even though on our body we feel where the knots are. Yeah, those of us that work with the body a lot, we know where the knots are. And over time, we might find ourselves in a situation where there's, some physical knots, some psychological knots, some mental knots, some emotional knots, and we might find ourselves in some situation like this, right? Where we have a big knot that is made up of many, many, many small knots. Yeah. And in many way, this could be, in many way you can see this as life, and that our maybe one of our purposes in life is to untie these knots, and to understand what is creating them, and to reach a stage as close as possible, as close as we can, to having a clear rope, a clear belt. So I've been analyzing a little bit about myself, and the only thing I can do with you is share with you my experience, and maybe it will help you somewhere along the road. So I've been recognizing lately a few places in my life where there is a knot. I'm aware of the knot, and I keep pulling on both sides, and I'm making the situation even worse, right? So the first thing I try to do in such situations, when I recognize them, the first thing I start doing is, first of all, I stop pulling. And every country I travel around the world has a variation of this sentence. Uh, in Israel, we say, if you're in a hole, first thing you do is stop digging further, right? So if I'm in a knot, the first thing I do is stop tugging on both sides, and I try to be still for a while and analyze the situation with a clear mind and just look at it. Okay. And when you do this, if you manage to quiet your thoughts and your mind, you might just see a solution and say, wow, instead of pulling, all I had to do was push. and the opposite action from what I was doing sometimes, not always, but sometimes loosens up the knot. Now, if it's a very easy knot like this, sometimes the release can be immediate. If it's a long knot that we've been tugging on for many, many years, sometimes the release could be a little bit less. But the second I put some space into the problem, many, many solutions can occur. So that's one thing I've been thinking about, trying to see in my past when there was a knot, and when I was tugging on it, making it worse, and when I could just stop for a second and see how it naturally, maybe I can reverse my action and release the knot. Another interesting thing I figured out lately, um, those of you that are really motivated about untying the knots, because one thing about knots you need to understand that you have to actively untie them. Okay, just like you actively created them, you have to actively untie them. Okay, so once you decide to play this game of untying the knots, I'm going to give you a small tip that I discovered lately where I think capoeira comes in very, very usefully, is that a lot of the knots in our lives were created by from the same reason. They just manifest on different planes of our existence. So the same reason that created my physical knot in the neck many times is the same reason that also creates a financial lock in my bank account, which sometimes could be the same reason that creates my relationship knot. Okay, so sometimes there is an underlying hint that creates all knots. But when I see this whole thing right now, it could be very, very, very intimidating and very, very scary to get out of this. And then I'm going to say, man, it took me 44 years to get into this knot. It's probably going to take me at least 95 years to get out of this knot, right? That's one of the reasons why many, many people are even afraid to start this process, because they're saying, oh my God, I've made so many mistakes along the way. Where I'm going to start fixing them. So, guys, this is your Christmas gift. There is a trick. There is a trick that sometimes works, is that if you recognize, I can now start and untie one knot at a time. I can fix my financial situation, and I can fix my marriage situation, and I can fix my social situation, and I can do that. But sometimes there is a shortcut, and as capoeiristas, we really like shortcuts. And a big part of the methodology we teach is practical shortcuts to get straight to the point. So sometimes, if you can recognize the lesson behind one knot, or maybe even the first knot, and you release that one, and you manage to understand the why, not the content, the context. If you understand the context of the knot, many times releasing one will automatically or very quickly release all of them. And you're going to find this out uh, in the future when you start practicing, that sometimes one knot can release a whole chain of knots, almost like a DNA activating. Okay, guys, so enjoy the holiday season. And 2023 was definitely challenging, okay, and not an easy time. But let's take this week of happiness, this week of these holiday seasons, to a little bit go inside and think about our knots.